Good afternoon. Thank you for viewing, liking, following the fan page of the Law Office of Travell Travis, your low-cost, high-quality law firm. Connect with us by visiting our website, email, or social media, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, all Travell Travis, website.com, email at gmail.com, and then as well on our social media. Very quickly, a shameless plug. 3 weeks ago, the Lord blessed me to release my first book entitled Don't Eat the Baby, The Characteristics of a Cannibalistic Church. I was able to research into the cannibalistic traits of several animals and learn how those attributes are being manifested in the church. And so if you're interested in a little bit of biology, a little bit of Bible, as well as a discussion of some of the current issues facing today's church, I encourage you to go to our website, don'teatthebaby.org, to purchase a copy for you and your ministry on today. Disclaimer, these videos are for educational and advertising purposes and is not a substitute for a consultation with an attorney, licensed attorney in your state. Today is a part 2 of something we covered about a month ago as to whether a church should apply for a 501c3 tax-exempt recognition. In that first discussion, we talked about what the legal definition or the legal criteria is to be considered a church. And so today I want to move into whether or not your church should actually submit an application for a 501c3 tax-exempt recognition from the IRS. Understand first what is a 501c3 application or recognition letter does. Basically, it allows your entity to be tax exempt from federal income taxes, really only. Tax exempt from federal income taxes only, meaning that the entity can make a profit but does not have to pay taxes on its profit like other business entities. So if you have a restaurant, you have a dry cleaners, you have a coffee shop, and you make a profit, you're going to have to pay taxes on that profit. I have a church, a school, or a ministry can arguably make hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in profit, but does not have to pay taxes to the federal government on those profits, going back to our tradition of separation of our church and state. However, just because a church is tax exempt does not mean that the employees of the nonprofit are tax exempt. So if you're a pastor or paid staff, or like in my case, I work for a university, we pay taxes. We pay federal, state taxes, as well as withholdings for Social Security and Medicare. So don't think that because you work for a nonprofit that you're tax exempt as well. Also, nonprofits may have to go through a separate process to be tax exempt when it comes to sales tax. You go to a store to buy office supplies or cleaning supplies. There's a separate step to perhaps be exempt from state sales tax. Also, if your church owns vehicles, it's a separate process. Also, property may differ depending on jurisdictions. Some jurisdictions, as soon as the property is titled and deed in the name of a church, it's tax exempt. Where there are other jurisdictions where the church must demonstrate its continuous use. So there have been churches that have purchased property with the intent to build and have had to pay taxes on that property essentially until the grand opening, until they got the occupancy permit and were ready to go in and use that place as a place of worship. So be mindful of that. Also, a church may also have to pay taxes on unrelated business income. So it's one thing to have a fundraiser. It's another thing when your fundraiser becomes a business in of itself. And so if you're renting your parking lot, perhaps you have apartments or commercial property, perhaps you have some other restaurant or what have you that the church owns. It's a source of income. Just because it's owned by the church doesn't mean that it's automatically tax exempt. That exemption may not extend to that entity. So that's unrelated business income. But a entity that has a religious, charitable, or educational purpose may apply for a 501c3 tax exemption. Now, with that being said, churches, church organizations, church auxiliaries, church conferences, church conventions are automatically tax exempt if they meet the criteria established by the IRS that we shared in our last video without actually filing the 501c3 tax exempt application. So let me repeat that. There was a slight disconnection of the internet. That churches, church organizations, ministries, church auxiliaries. So if you have a church denomination that has its youth ministry, a conference or convention, fellowship, are automatically tax exempt if they meet the criteria of a church without filing paperwork to be recognized as a tax exempt entity from the IRS. And that's very important to note. However, a church may elect to apply for the 501c3 tax exemption from the IRS. One, if it owns a nonprofit entity outside the church, perhaps a school, a college, a daycare center, a nursing home. Perhaps it has a community development corporation, which is helping to do community revitalization. Then if that entity may have to have its 501c3 recognition letter to be tax exempt. Also, if a church is looking for outside funding or support for its activities, although you're not required, some will require the 501c3 recognition letter in order to donate money, to donate land, to donate equipment. Perhaps you're looking for computers or even services, attorney services, accounting services, janitorial services, lawn care services. So if you're seeking money beyond the tithes, the offerings, the fundraisers of the church, and you're looking for government funding, perhaps government funding in the terms of 3 levels, the federal, excuse me for the bad connection. So if you're looking for the federal, state, or local government, corporations, local businesses, foundations, or even perhaps private citizens, a lot of them will not donate to your church or ministry without the 501c3 designation. You could tell them it's not required. You can show them the code. But for many donors, gives them a certain level of confidence. It gives your ministry a certain level of legitimacy, credibility as a nonprofit. What does it mean? Because the IRS has essentially reviewed, approved, vetted, screened, and has given you this privileged recognition. And so it gives a certain level of confidence to these donors that you're going to use the money for appropriate purposes and appropriate goals that you're trying to achieve. Now, very quickly, there are 5 questions that you should consider in determining whether or not you should actually go through the process of applying for a 501c3 tax exempt recognition. Once again, we said churches are automatically tax exempt if they meet the criteria of a church. But perhaps there is a time when you want to actually have the recognition from the IRS. Number 1, what are you planning to do? Are you planning to do more than just have church, have conferences, have revivals? Do you really plan to get involved with the community? And to what scale are you looking to get involved with the community? And so it's one thing to do some outreach, some evangelism that's funded by the church. It's another thing when you're doing it on such a magnitude in which you're seeking or requiring the support of perhaps non-members to donate to the cause or the activity or event that you're having. So what are you planning to do if you get the 501c3 recognition? Number two, how do you plan to fund your activities? If you're going to fund your activities primarily through the tithes, the offerings, the special donations of members, then you may not need a 501c3 recognition letter. However, if you're going to go to local businesses, government entities for grants, sponsorships, foundations, private citizens that are not members or friends of the church, then they once again may require, show me the letter. Show me that you are a tax-exempt organization. Number three, who will be on the leadership team of this entity? So once again, if the board of directors, the trustees, the leadership of this endeavor will be solely the members of the church, and the leadership for the church is also the leadership for the daycare center or the school or the nursing home, then you may once again have to consider how you want to structure the two entities. However, for a lot of your outreach or for your nonprofit businesses, if you will, your school, your daycare, your nursing home, your community development corporation, you may pull from the community, friends of the church, people who are not members of the church, to be on your board of directors, to be on your leadership team, your steering committee. And so once again, if you're going to have a different composition of your leadership team or leadership structure, then you may need a separate entity. And then that entity, you may want to get the 501c3 tax-exempt recognition for that entity separate and apart from your church. Number four, what are your goals for this outreach activity or this service to the community? Is it merely to serve the community, or is it to not only serve but to minister to the community? There are a lot of entities that will donate for feeding the homeless. They'll donate for giving clothes to the needy. They'll donate to a computers for an after-school program as long as it's serving a secular purpose. However, if your goal is not only to serve, but also to minister, perhaps you're going to have Bible study during your after-school program. Perhaps you're going to have praise and worship and a short word and counselors when you have your feeding of the homeless. There will be some grants and some donors will prohibit or limit your ability to proselytize or to disciple or to evangelize in doing those activities. Going back to the faith-based initiative that came into play under executive order under President George W. Bush. Basically, the faith-based initiative said that if a church is providing a secular function, that it should not be discriminated against in receiving federal funding. So if you're having a feeding of the homeless, you have a soup kitchen, and you're feeding the homeless, just because it's the church that's feeding the homeless versus some other nonprofit, the church should be able to get money for feeding the homeless, just like the other nonprofit organization. The problem with that is that church has to simply feed the hungry, feed the homeless. If that church wants to, once again, have devotion, praise and worship, once again, have someone to give a word of encouragement, perhaps provide tracts and literature, then the grant or the funding agency may prohibit that. And so once again, you have to decide, what am I trying to accomplish? Is it merely to serve the community, or am I also looking to minister to the community? If you want to serve and minister, then you may want to fund that through your church and not have the restrictions or limitations or prohibitions that may come from receiving federal funds. However, on the other hand, if it's simply to serve and you're not really trying to evangelize, proselytize, then you may be comfortable in receiving federal funding or private funding with those types of restrictions and limitations. So number four, what are your goals for the ministry? And then lastly, number five, how much money do you have available even to apply for a 501c3 tax-exempt recognition? Once again, a church is automatically exempt without filing anything. That's free as long as you meet the criteria of a church. However, if you're going to go into some of these other areas, then there's a cost. There's a cost to incorporate whether it's in Virginia, non-stock corporation. Other states have nonprofit corporation, religious corporations that create your legal structure. You have to have your articles of corporation. You have to then obtain your EIN number, employer identification number. And then you also have to then file for the 501c3 application. Now, as of 2018, those fees have gone down. The filing fee. But that doesn't include the fee to an attorney or to an accountant to fill out the application, as well as prepare all the supporting documents that go along with it. So while a nonprofit organization may have the least amount of money, it costs probably the most money in terms of formation, because all of this has to be presented to the reviewer, to the examiner at the IRS, to determine whether or not you are worthy or eligible of this privileged status of being a tax-exempt organization. And so for a church that's just getting started, in terms of trying to get equipment, evangelize, outreach, marketing, perhaps paying musicians and paying rent and other things, you have to decide whether or not at the present time, whether paying for the package for a 501c3 application is the best use of your money at the present time, depending on what you're trying to do initially. Now, once again, if everything is funded, ran, and your intentions are to minister, then you may want to just use your church, your tax exempt as a church, and fund it, control it through the church. However, if you're looking to do more in the community and you're looking to expand your funding source to corporations, local businesses, the government, private foundation, citizens in the community, perhaps you're looking to expand your leadership to perhaps members of the community, then you may want to consider applying for the 501c3 tax-exempt recognition letter. Once again, if you're doing typical church stuff, you may not need it. But if you're doing things a little bit bigger, broader for the community, then it may be something that you seriously have to consider. Just for example, and I may have already shared some of these, but once again, if the church is going to feed the homeless, church can decide that within its budget, tithes, offers, donations, we're going to feed the homeless once a month. And with that, we're going to pass out tracts, we're going to have counselors, we're going to have short devotional service, and totally funded through the church. Someone else may decide that we want to get a grant to do that. And so most likely, if you're going to get a grant, you got to be a 501c3 recognized organization, and you may want to create a separate entity to funnel those funds, to hold those funds for the specific purpose of feeding the homeless on a regular basis through your church. Also, for example, second example is maybe a back to school. Even though it's July, many people are considering back to school time. And so you have to decide if you want to have a back to school rally, back to school event, and you want to give out school supplies. You can decide as a church through your tithes, through your offerings, through your donations, to give 100 backpacks full of school supplies, have a barbecue, pull out the grill, hot dogs, hamburgers, chips, drinks, have your inflatables, and have this big back to school rally totally funded by the church. And you do not need a 501c3 tax exempt recognition to do that. However, on the other hand, apologize for my connection. I apologize for that technical delay. But just going back to the example real quick that I have. Perhaps your church is looking to have a back to school event and you want to give away 100 backpacks full of school supplies, have your inflatables, have free haircuts, as well as, have church barbecue, hot dogs, hamburgers, chips, sodas. A church can decide to fully fund that as a church. Have a service, prayer, give out tracts, minister to community, counselors, the whole 9 yards. Totally fund that through the church. The church does not necessarily need a 501c3 tax exempt recognition to do that. However, if the church is saying, you know what, we want to go super large. We want to serve the community 1,000 backpacks full of school supplies, and we want Chick-fil-A to provide the food. We want Coca-Cola to donate the sodas, and we're going to local businesses to donate school supplies, backpacks, free haircuts. Either they're going to give the school supplies or they're going to donate the money. We got some type of grant that's dealing with at-risk youth in the community, those who low income or whatever the case may be, and you want to do something on that scale with outside funding, then you may need a 501c3 tax exempt recognition letter in order to be able to go out into the community to secure that type of funding from the government, private citizens, foundations, and local businesses. So once again, it really depends on what you're trying to do and what you're trying to accomplish. Another example may be a grant for abstinence education. There are grants out there for abstinence education, but it may be restricted to the emotional, psychological, and the physical issues related to premarital sex or abstinence. But you may want to share the spiritual, the biblical, soul ties, what the scripture says about sex outside of marriage, the spiritual consequences that come along with it. And so once again, you may have to determine, if I want to teach it my way, then I may have to use my money. But if I'm willing to perhaps say, you know what, the ends justify the means, I got funding, I'm teaching it, even if I don't necessarily address the spiritual, that's fine, then you may want to get the grant, and you may want to use your 501c3 tax exempt recognition letter to obtain that grant. So once again, it really just depends on who you're trying to reach, how you're trying to reach them, what are your broader goals in terms of trying to reach them, as well as your funding source for it. So once again, if you're thinking about serving the poor, you're serving youth, the elderly, veterans, perhaps former felons, there are grants out there, there are donations, there are private foundations out there. And so once again, if you're called to serve those groups and you have found entities, organizations, private citizens that are willing to fund activities geared towards those groups, then it may be a requirement for you to have the 501c3 tax exempt recognition in order to get the funding for those groups. On the other hand, you can decide to minister to those groups on your own through the funding that comes through the tithes, offerings, and contributions and fundraisers from your church. So now in closing, if you're going to go that route with the outside funding, what is recommended is to keep the church and your outreach ministry separate. So you may have First Apostolic Church, but also First Apostolic Ministries. First Apostolic Church operates as a church, serves as a church, does church things. First Apostolic Ministries is your tax-exempt entity, 501c3 entity that gets the funding from the grants, the corporations, the private citizens, the foundations, to do those extra things in the community that you're trying to do. Okay, and so that way you're keeping the money separate. You're keeping perhaps the leadership structure separate. Even some of the goals and purposes may be totally separate. So you may want to consider forming that separate entity if you're going to serve in that way through those funding sources at that level. However, there's a lot of churches that are doing great things in terms of an after-school program, and it's without a 501c3, just merely through the generosity of the members as well as citizens of the community. So bear that in mind. So once again, if you're trying to get computers donated, food donated, sponsors, then you may need the extra paperwork in order to get those entities to fund what you are doing. So that's really something that you have to consider from a biblical standpoint, from a financial standpoint. What are my goals? What are my objectives? Do I really need outside money? Do I really want outside money to do what I'm trying to do? Can I do it within the church? Accomplish my broader goals of not just serving but ministering. I don't have to worry about any type of conflict of interest or anyone coming in and auditing me or checking up on me to make sure I'm not doing more than what the grant allows or the donation allows. Then you have to consider whether or not you just want to do these things through the church, through your traditional revenue or income streams for the church. So in closing, if you have any additional questions or like to explore further the pros and cons of applying for a 501c3 tax-exempt recognition letter, I suggest contacting a lawyer, not just any attorney, but a lawyer that specializes in church law or in nonprofits. Not every attorney deals with nonprofits or churches, so it's important that you contact an attorney that specializes in church law or tax-exempt or nonprofit organizations. Or you can also contact this firm, as we said at the beginning of this program, our website, travelltravis.com, email travelltravis@gmail.com, as well as Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, and YouTube. You can find me under the name of Travell Travis. Once again, thank you for viewing this video sponsored by the Law Office of Travell Travis. We ask that you please post, like, share, comment. Feel free to inbox us questions or topics for the future. Even as this video is streaming, if you have a question or comment, feel free to share it before we close on today. Once again, a disclaimer, this video is for educational advertising purposes. It is not a substitute for consulting and a licensed attorney in your state. May God bless you and may God bless your ministry. Have a blessed day in the Lord.